the Air. It is a product of Rethinking Climate. It is a sustainability communication project that tries to open conversations about complex and overlooked climate-related issues to make them more personal and accessible by speaking to experts. On this episode, we are interviewing Antonio Lopez. He's a leading international specialist on media literacy education. His research focuses on bridging sustainability with media literacy. He's currently one of the top global experts in the field of ecomedia literacy. His book, Ecomedia Literacy, Integrating Ecology into Media Education, is available online starting November 13th. So thank you for being with us today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Well, the first question is, of course, what is ecomedia literacy?
Okay, well, let's step back and for a second and talk about what is literacy.
Yeah.
And as most people are familiar with, literacy is essentially learning how to read or write. But in a multimedia or multimodal environment where people are not just reading text like in books or newspapers, but they're watching videos, they're seeing visual images, they're listening to different types of media. So media literacy is a type of literacy that's developed to develop the ability to read and write in different forms, different types of communication, besides just actual, handwriting or typing or text. The next turn from the concept of media literacy, this is sort of my flavor that I'm adding to it, is to change the concept of media to ecomedia. And what I mean by that is media have a relationship with the environment that is by and large unacknowledged, or people are not aware of it. And even people who are media scholars quite often don't understand the relationship between media and the environment. So when you call media ecomedia, it's a signal to tell people, hey, when we talk about media in this context, what we're saying is that there's an ecological component to it. So your listeners probably are wondering at this point, what is that relationship? And the way that I formulate this idea is there are basically two different ways. There's what I call the ecological footprint of media, and then there's the ecological mindprint of media. So the ecological footprint would literally be the actual material impact of our media on the environment. And the impacts are multiple. I mean, you can start with the way that our gadgets are made. For example, the rare earth minerals that are used for our circuit boards, for our chips, for our phones are primarily come from our conflict minerals. These are minerals that are mined in conflict regions like in the Congo. And those regions where they're mining the materials for our devices are heavily damaged. The environments are heavily damaged by this process. Also lithium, which we use for our batteries, which is primarily mined in the Andes in South America, has a strong impact on the environment. And then you have the actual manufacturing process of the devices, and the chemicals, the plastics, the metal alloys, the creation of chips, which have to be created. Microprocessors have to be made at like super high temperatures of like tens of thousands of degrees. I mean, it's unbelievable the kind of environmental changes that they have to make in order to produce these devices. And then, of course, our gadgets get shipped around the world. They have packaging that, every time we buy something that's in a box, which has plastic and paper. And then at the end of its life cycle, these devices get tossed or recycled. Usually they get tossed. Only 13% of our devices get actually recycled. And usually it's called e-waste. It gets shipped off to countries like Ghana or in India or China, and those places where these devices are sent to become very toxified as a result of this process. And then on top of that, there's the energy consumption of the servers. All of our apps, all of our devices depend on that there's data being processed and running all the time in the background. And server farms require as much energy as they produce as much CO2 as the airline industry. And this will double in 10 years because every time, if you think about all the new processes like artificial intelligence, bitcoins, or cryptocurrencies require heavy computer processing. So you have to build more and more server farms, require more and more energy, and also materially they require more material. You have to build those computers to fill those server farms. And that uses water. I mean, I could go on. And then you have to think about the infrastructure of our global communication system, of cables, satellites, cell towers. I mean, it's huge. So that would be the ecological footprint. And then the ecological mindprint is how do media influence our beliefs and our ideas about the environment. And again, there's different ways to look at it. You can look at it like how the system of advertising influences consumption and consumerism. It produces this culture of waste, and then which is unsustainable, of course. But then in the political arena, it's where all the discourses around political change occur. And so why is it, for example, in the U.S. that climate change is still considered controversial? Well, that's because the fossil fuel industry was very successful at manipulating the media in order to create confusion and doubt about whether this is real or not. And then the last area I would say in terms of environmental impact would be our sense of space, place, and time, and how our devices change our relationship with our immediate environment and our sense of like being in a place. And that could have detrimental impacts because a lot of environmental activists and educators believe that you should, if you want to change something, you need to care about it. And if you're not present in the environment, why would you care about it? So these are all different aspects of how the media influence and impact the environment. So that's why I use the term ecomedia. So it's a way of getting people to become literate about these different issues related to media. And you'd be surprised that in my field, very few people actually are aware of this.
I think what you say is very interesting because, first of all, not many know about this. Second of all, not many are informed. But as well, there is, again, the assumption, as you were saying, that people should only care when it relates to them rather than it should be a natural thing. Literacy that you've carried out and why that is happening in protection of, again, something that's happening to everybody. So I think it brings to next question quite fits well is what is ecomodernism and what are the limitations?
Okay, well, ecomodernism is related to what I study because let me give a bigger context. In order for people to talk about the environment, they also have to have some understanding of ethics and values and ideology. And it's pretty clear that if you really explore what are the roots of our system and why the environment is so disregarded in a sort of consumer capitalist society, its roots are in modernity. You have to go back in time and to look at what is the point where society started to separate this nature from humans, nature from society. And, a lot of people who are interested in like post-colonial studies are increasingly drawing our attention to the fact that capitalism has its roots originally in slavery. But then if you think about like how did capitalism become what it is today, you have to go back to colonialism because it was the extraction of wealth from different colonies around the world brought to Europe or North America that created the wealth of the system that we have now. And much of that wealth was generated through mining and through exploitation. And in order to justify this kind of economic system and to justify the exploitation of nature, you also had to justify the exploitation of humans. So humans and nature got categorized, there became a category if you were not white and not European, you were put into this other category of primitive, uncivilized, of not human. So whether you were black or indigenous, you were put in the same grouping as nature, as something wild. And since neither of these were human, these were allowed to be exploited. And so these belief systems are ingrained in modernity. They're ingrained in our economic system. And the way you see them manifested now is in these discourses around, let's say, development. And this idea that you have to develop into like a European-style modern capitalist economy. So if you don't do that, then you're undeveloped. And that's almost like the same language we talk about children. Like a child has to develop into an adult. And it's inherently racist. Say that all these types of discourses have their roots in modernity. That's the context. So when I talk about eco-modernism, the basic argument of eco-modernism is like a backlash against, I think, certain strains of environmentalism, which are sort of anti-technology or anti-civilization. And those elements do exist in the environmentalist movement. And I think eco-modernists, what they say is, hey, modernity was actually a good thing. It created prosperity. It created people have live longer lives. People have they're safer. There's been benefits from modernity. So why don't we create an eco-modernity? Why don't we create like some kind of technology that would be beneficial for humanity? But the problem with this kind of thinking is that, there's this old quote, I'm going to paraphrase it, from Einstein, that you can't fix a problem with the same thinking that created the problem. People who advocate for eco-modernity don't acknowledge the inherent contradictions and problems in capitalism, and they also don't acknowledge the legacy of colonialism in a current system, and they don't address issues of like eco-justice and racism, which for me should be at the forefront. And so what eco-modernists advocate for are sort of these insane ideas of geoengineering, putting chemicals, like putting iron filings into the sea to create, bacteria infections of the water to reflect sunlight, or to seed clouds with chemicals. The people who think up this stuff have no idea what the consequences of these kind of actions are. And I believe that the fact that they're dreaming up these ideas, for example, I heard an interesting interview with someone saying that some of the proposals of where they would put chemicals in the sky to reflect sunlight would be that skies would no longer be blue, that the sky would always be white. Now, can you imagine what that would be like for the rest of eternity of human history, that the humans were so stupid they couldn't reduce how much carbon they put in the atmosphere. Instead, they turned the sky white. And so, well, we don't need a blue sky anymore. We want to keep burning our fossil fuels. So that to me is why I'm really against eco-modernism.
I think that what you're telling us demonstrates once more human arrogance, that instead of facing our responsibilities in the environmental state, we try to find what we can call tricks in solutions that, in my opinion, will not work. And that's a whole other debate about geoengineering, as you were saying. Or, for instance, you would expect the media to play a stronger role in showcasing the proper argument with the public, a public who often sometimes believe they're doing something well by making choices like buying products in a plastic bag, but it says no palm oil on top. And so where do you think the conversation does not work well?
Well, one of the problems, first of all, when you talk about ecomedia, you talk about the environmental impact of our technologies, it creates kind of a problem of hypocrisy in the sense that, well, I'm still using these computers, even though I know they're very damaging to the environment. I still use phones. Although I have to say I do have a fair phone, which is a better phone than a normal one. But, and my answer is that, first of all, you have to use what's available. You can't start from zero. We already have a communication system in place. And I wanted to actually, this is related to what I was saying before, which is there's a strain of environmental thinking which is very anti-technology, which actually drives people away from environmentalism because they feel like people don't really want to change their lifestyle. So there has to be a little bit of a compromise in the sense that people need to understand when you're advocating for the environment, it doesn't mean you have to become like go live in a cave or go live on a farm. But we do have to make changes. The thing is that the changes, if you look at the big corporations like BP, the big fossil fuel companies, they're all for people being environmentally conscious on an individual level because it means they don't have to do anything. So they even advocate these ideas of being like consumer conscious and buy green stuff, because the more you do that, the less they have to change. So what really has to happen is probably a little bit of a combination of we do have to adjust our lifestyle somewhat. We do have power as consumers, like for example, in order to change these media technologies, we have to advocate to the technology companies to change their practices. On the other hand, we need laws. We need rules that say you can't use conflict minerals. We need rules that say the companies have to buy back or they have to take back their old technology. If they had to do that, they would change their practices in a minute. So there has to be kind of a mix between sort of the so-called lifestyle politics and then also actual structural change. But as I've been saying throughout, ultimately it's this issue of eco-justice, which the more you look at it, it just comes down to inequality, because top 10% of the people in the economy are producing 50% of the CO2. So actually, let me bring in another discussion point, which is the idea of the Anthropocene, because people are using this term sort of uncritically all over the place. Every time they think I'm going to do something environmental, I'm going to call it the Anthropocene. But the problem with the term Anthropocene is that it focuses on the results and the causes of environmental problems as if it was inherently a human-caused problem, but it's a structural problem. It's like, oh yeah, men will be men. That's why we have all this environmental damage. But it's not human nature. It's structural. It has to do with the system that we have. So we have to also, push back against, deconstruct, and argue against the way that people are also framing the problem. This idea, I think what you were referring to before was this idea of greenwashing, like we just tweak a little thing in our product, we put the word natural, or we have sort of some pseudo concept of organic and somehow it makes it better. Okay, that's fine for, it has maybe a minor impact in a very small way, but it doesn't substitute for real structural change and, fixing the problem of inequality, accounting for the fact that disproportionately the people that are polluting and destroying the planet are a very small number of people. Yeah, by the way, those people have addresses. We know where they live.
Well, I did once joke in a previous episode that we cannot go to companies and throw stones at their buildings, but I'm not suggesting we should do that. But again, there are addresses to go solicit.
The thing is, we can. What we need, of course, I want just to be clear for the record, I'm not advocating,
I know, of course. Neither am I advocating doing something like that, of course.
Point being is we know who's doing it. So,
yes.
And we can identify the source. And it comes down to we need fundamental, the system has to be changed. How that change comes about, I think it has to be done intersectionally. These issues are all related to issues of racism, to patriarchy. So we can't disconnect those problems. They have to be worked together intersectionally.
So one question I always have is, who do you think should bring forward to the change? Because I understand that there isn't really a clear answer to that. It's not easy to have an answer for that. But at the same time, it feels like what you're saying is also somebody listening to this could say, well, if I don't have to bring to a change because it's politics and economy and there must be laws that then shift these big companies to make better decisions, then I don't really have to do much. Or something, well, it's not going to really change the world, will it? Then I'm just going to keep going and doing what I usually do. But then if you go and speak with politicians, of course, there's a whole big chapter or conversation over there. But then how can we frame this conversation of who has to bring the change? And if you have an answer of who mostly has to bring the change?
Whenever I start teaching this stuff, people get overwhelmed and they get depressed because like, oh, I can't do anything about it. It's too big. I'm just one person. And there's this old story that anarchists used to tell, which is like, if you in a snowstorm, you have all these little tiny snowflakes falling on the branch, and all it takes is one snowflake to make the branch break, right? We don't know who's going to be that snowflake. But I mean, think of Greta Thunberg, for example, just a teenager from Sweden, just doing her own thing, and then she sparked this whole international movement. That was quite amazing, and also. Yeah. Her ability to speak truth to power, the younger generation shaming the older generation. I mean, I think that's important. But to go back to the issue of like, when people get bummed out, depressed, and overwhelmed, and like, well, what can I do about this? There's nothing I can do. First of all, you have to figure out what it is that you're for. So part of the problem is people always talk about what they're against, but what is it that you really want? So people have to be clear about that. And then secondly, what is the thing that you could do? What is the thing that you like? What is the skill? Or, what is, and, it could be cooking, it could be food, it could be taking care of people, or it could be, who knows, poster design. I mean, everyone has a different skill. I mean, my thing is this media literacy. I'm just one guy. I don't know how many people I can influence through my work, but I don't care. I'm just going to still do it. And if enough people, and then find the people that will support you, and you can be part of that community, so you don't feel alone. So that's one of the reasons why protests are important, because not that the protest itself is going to change any particular policy, but it shows the world, for one, that a certain number of people care about something, but also it helps you feel solidarity, that you have allies, that there's a lot of people that you could that agree with you, that share your views, and you don't feel so isolated. I mean, for example, when the Fridays for Future protests were starting to pick up steam last year, or maybe it was even earlier this year, I can't remember, there was like a Friday for Future protest in Rome. It was unbelievable. It was like hundreds of thousands of people, mostly kids, mostly 12, 13, 14-year-old kids with their parents. I took my kids. I mean, for my kids, it was an amazing feeling. They just couldn't, they was like, wow, it's so great. There's so many people here. They felt so good. And these were all like middle school kids, elementary school kids, telling the adults to get their act together. For me, it was such a powerful experience, and powerful for the kids. That's an example of where you want to find your allies and find people. And those are always important moments. But then, the hard work, the day-to-day work, the gritty work is just how you live your life. And I think it is important to have, say before that lifestyle is overblown, but I mean, I think it's important to, like, if you have options, like to take the bus versus drive a car, those things are good choices, because you're voting with your feet. You're supporting something that you want. And I certainly vote for the products that you want. Like, if I have to buy coffee, I should buy organic coffee or fair trade coffee, because that's beneficial to the people that make that coffee. So I'll continue to do that. But it's just that in itself is not going to be everything. So I think what happens in a consumer capitalist society is that the concept of citizenship has been replaced by consumerism. So rather than the idea that you vote and you participate in a democratic process, it's transformed into, well, the only way you can participate in the system is what you buy. And we have to get past that.
What you were saying about the Fridays for Future, it's very nice what they're doing. It's very beautiful, involving the younger generation, and finally we're doing that. And it's really moving forward the fact that you're listening to a younger generation, something that maybe did not happen even just 5 to 10 years ago. I'm just wondering about the day after. Is the whole idea of yes, I found my allies, yes, I'm going to make decisions, and then the day after comes. And I always find there's a lot of stigma in people who actually move forward and maybe try to change their lifestyle better, or advocate for something that not many agree with, and that's hard. It's always trying to fight something bigger than yourself. You watch TV and you see whatever you see, that buying products just because it's cool, and you don't wonder what's the impact of whatever you buy.
Well, do you mind if I jump in? So
Sure.
You kind of have to. I'm not a professional activist, and I'm not steeped in this literature, but from what I understand, the way that activism works is you sort of lay the groundwork and the infrastructure for when the opportunity comes to make a change. So to give you an example, the explosion of the Black Lives Matter movement this year in the U.S., and not just the U.S., but all over the world, people working in that space have been doing it for, years, generations. And if you ask someone like a year ago, will we have a national discussion about defunding the police? People would kind of like laugh at you, say, no, we're not there yet. But then it happens, right? There was that horrible situation with George Floyd, and it kind of lit a spark, and it created a conversation to the point where, like, even the president of our university was forced to make a statement about Black lives. Now, at the end of the day, did anything really change? Well, that remains to be seen. But the point being is that the groundwork had the ideas, the activism, the organizational aspects were already there. And so when the moment came to elevate this discourse to a national level, it just popped right in. You never know how some of these, like we had the Fukushima nuclear accident in Japan. A week later, Germany canceled all of its nuclear power plants. It just happened like that. Even though people have been working on this for 20, 30 years, it just took one situation which everyone said, okay, that's it. Who knows? I mean, sadly, I hate to be in a situation where a giant piece of the polar north or Antarctica splits off and goes to the sea, and Manhattan is under 6 feet of water, and all of a sudden people are like, oh yeah, we have a problem with climate change. Let's do something about it. I mean, it could
late.
But, I think people, every year there's more and more evidence that people are experiencing directly in their lives, whether it's fires in California or in Australia or the Amazon. Really think about this. In 2006, in all the presidential debates in the U.S., there was not a single question about climate change. Now, this year, before the presidential election, there was a whole debate devoted just to climate change. Every debate had a climate change question. Every politician, every party has to have a climate position. That's a big change. Other things to think about. When I first moved to Italy in 2007, in the U.S., gay marriage was illegal, marijuana was illegal. Now I go back there, everyone's gay and everyone's smoking pot. It is legal. And that it's still shocking to me because I'm not used to seeing that, but that's how fast things can change. When I was a kid, you could smoke on an airplane. Can you imagine now people smoking on an airplane? I mean, things do change. And once you go from one side to the other of the change, you forget that there was a before and an after. It happens. I do feel somewhat optimistic in the sense that I feel like people are waking up. And just, in my own field, in the work that I do, the first time that I went to a conference that talked about eco-media literacy, only 2 people came to my presentation. The presentation next door, this was in 2012, so pretty recently, was about Facebook, and there was like 200 people in that room. So Facebook was the hot topic, but no one wanted to talk about the environment. But now when I go to conferences, lots of people come to these sessions. Now I've been invited to contribute chapters to books where normally people would not think about this. So people are aware. And again, it was like I was doing all this work sort of quietly, and then all of a sudden people say, hey, maybe we need to think about it. And I could be like, hey, check this out. I've already come up with a whole framework. And so I already did the work, even though it wasn't popular. Now that it's getting some traction, started to think this through. I don't want to be the only person. I want other people to be involved. I don't want to own this. But someone had to start it. In this case, it happened to be me. At some point, hopefully, it'll be hundreds of people.
You say that activists must have their groundwork and so on, but why wouldn't you call yourself activist if you are taking part in the conversation and you are doing something about it?
Well, because...
Can you also not be an activist and still do something about it? Why do we have to pinpoint the word activist?
Yeah, I hate those words. I mean, I hate the word environmentalist, for example. I hate that word. I am not an environmentalist. I'm a human being, okay? And as a human being, I'm part of the environment. So by default, I'm an environmentalist. It's just like, I don't like these labels. I mean, I don't even like the label professor. It's just like, okay, I'm a person who does this thing, but I'm just a human being. I don't like these hierarchies. This is why, one of the points I make in my book is that I really hope the term eco-media becomes meaningless or not useful, because I just want every time someone thinks of media, they think of eco-media. Yeah. I don't want there to be 2 different categories, right? Yeah. In the same way, I don't want to have a category, here's a human and here's an environmentalist. I just want everyone to be an environmentalist. Yeah. And that's that. Or everyone to be an anti-racist. We're in a situation where people need to have these sort of categories in order to organize the way the society works. And, the fact is, there are people who are, quote unquote, professional activists. That's what they do. That's their life. They could be working in unions or, running nonprofits, NGOs, things like that, where it's actually their job. And, I'm not that kind of a person. It's not my job. But rather than activist, I would just call it more like citizenship, just be engaged.
And do you hope that your research can also reach and possibly change something with bigger media corporations?
Yes. I mean, the problem is big media corporations in some ways are already greenwashing themselves. So, for example, you may or may not know that News Corp, which owns Fox News, Rupert Murdoch, who's one of the most right-wing anti-climate persons in the world, they converted all their company to green energy. Now, why did he do that, even though that's against his politics? Because what part of their ideology is to say, we don't need the government to tell us to do it, we'll do it ourselves. And two, there's a good business reason for them, it's cheaper. Three, I don't know, I guess, I don't know. I mean, but CBS, which is another huge media company, had a project called Ecomedia, which was totally ridiculous. The way that it worked was an advertiser could donate part of the money like the way this is for the benefit of your listeners, the way that media companies make money is advertisers pay them to use their space. Let's say there's a 30-second slot on television. The advertiser and the media company would donate, let's say 10% of the cost of that ad to a nonprofit. That nonprofit maybe makes solar panels for schools. And in exchange for doing that, the advertiser gets to put a little green leaf logo on their ad saying that they did something good for the environment. But that's a kind of greenwashing, because all you're doing is making like a car company put a green logo on their car ad saying, oh yeah, we donated some money for some solar panels, yet they're designing cars which are really bad for the environment. So I'm somewhat skeptical about companies. I think the change really has to be in the level of policy and government. Like you need to create a situation. So I do advocate for what I would say a green eco-media, which would be like a publicly funded media, not private media. Part of the strategy would be you have to break up Facebook and Google. You can't have these monopolies. Amazon, you got to break them all up and turn them into utilities and take away the profit motive, because it's the profit motive that drives all the disinformation, that drives all the consumer behavior, the fake news. You have to remove that incentive. Somewhat realistic in the sense that for the changes that I want to see happen really have to be on the level of regulation. The government has to step in and break up monopolies, create rules, nationalize, whatever it takes, but to change the profit motive, take that out of the media. Now, in terms of other changes that I hope that my work will produce, well, ideally, whenever I teach this, my hope is that the students will become, at the minimum, more aware, but two, more active in the kind of choices they make, but also educating people that they know. And maybe if enough people are aware of these issues, then you have a general change in the society.
So before I ask you about your book that's coming out, why do you think we're going slowly in the changes we're seeing?
Well, I mean, I don't have a perfect answer. Part of the problem is human nature, that we are not able to plan for the future. That it's hard for us to, that's also cultural. Native Americans had this idea of taking care of the land for 7 generations. And that's a cultural attitude. There's just another problem, which is our cognitive, we're wired to respond to immediate threats, but it's very difficult for us to plan for a future, for threats that we don't see. And, a lot of the changes that scientists are telling us about are going to happen in 30, 50 years. And people are just struggling to deal with day to day. And, economically, people are struggling to just pay the rent. So why are they going to think about anything else other than survival? So that's part of the problem as well. And then you have the entrenched power structure, which has vested. Their interests are so vested that it's very hard to dislodge them. You'll even see, what we'll see in the coming years with Biden as president, even though he's promised to address climate change, you can be sure that the people at the table are primarily going to be corporations, because that's the power structure. So there does have to be a bottom-up movement that's going to, force. And I think, Obama said this. They expected him to do all these changes, and he said that he needed people to get out in the streets and to fight for things, to demonstrate this is what people want. And when it came to like pipeline projects, it wasn't until there was a mass movement that they got canceled. I mean, unfortunately, Trump, reinstated these projects, but the political will to cancel these projects didn't exist until you had a movement in the streets. Change comes in different ways. I also would mention one thing that the power structure understands very well is hegemony, and how do you achieve hegemony? Well, you influence the culture through you finance schools, think tanks, pay for science, you pay for the ideas, you create, you have an intellectual structure that you can fall back on. You also invest in politics, and you cultivate candidates. I mean, they figured this out in the 1970s and they were successful. So I tip my hat to them for being very clever and smart and forward thinking, that they achieved all their goals. The most clear manifestation of that would be in the US, at least with the Supreme Court. And it's not religious issues that is important. It's the fact that this Supreme Court will probably try to cancel any kind of government regulation against businesses that are polluting. That's the whole reason that they push these type of conservative candidates. And they achieved this because they created think tanks. They funded department chairs. They donated money to universities. On a certain level, the left has to catch up and do the same thing. They have to get into the nuts and bolts of how people are educated, create that influence.
Yeah, which I think is the perfect point for next question. So can you tell us a little bit about your book and what it touches?
Okay, well, so the book, this is my fourth book. So I've already written several about the problem of trying to green media education. Actually, my first book, Media Ecology, was a result of when I worked with Native Americans, and I was working in these programs to bring technology to the reservation, and being conflicted about what would be the impact of these technologies, computers in particular, on the culture, and try to think deeply about what are the benefits or what are the dangers of this. So that really started my whole thought process. And the book that I have now is sort of coming out at the other end of this, which is people who teach media, who work in media education, they might care about these issues, but they don't understand them, or they don't know how to do it. So you might have someone who teaches, just sort of a regular media teacher who's like, yeah, I care about the environment, but I don't know how to put this into my course. So this book was meant to do that, was like, okay, if you're interested in environmental issues and you want to incorporate that into your curriculum, here's some ideas, and here's the way to think about it. Here's the structure. And so part of the book, the first half of the book is more of an analysis. So some of the things I was talking about earlier, like about ecomodernism, about the Anthropocene, and about colonialism and racism, I talk about all that because I want to at least have a framework to talk about how the system works. And then the second half of the book is what are the different ways that, when I was talking about the media footprint and the media mindprint, where will we teach media, do we see that? What theorists or what ideas that we normally teach, how would you apply these ideas? How would you grade these modules in your class? So if you have a section in your class about journalism and news and propaganda, how could you turn that into a discussion about the environment? So so most of the rest of the book is very practical. And then I have a chapter about pedagogy, which is, the way you teach these issues, sort of a discussion of policy changes, like what can we do to change education?
I think I've taken a lot of your time, so I appreciate it very much. So thank you for this interview. And for our listeners, Clearing the Air is on social media. So we spoke about Facebook and Twitter not being positive corporations, but go put like and subscribe to our channel. So thank you again.
Okay, thank you very much.